June 23, 1941, 14:30 hours. A farm near Guildford, Surrey, England. Private Antonio Mancini stepped down from the military lorry and looked at the English countryside with confusion that bordered on suspicion. Behind him, 15 other Italian prisoners climbed out with similar expressions, men who'd been captured in North Africa 2 months earlier, transported to Britain, processed through POW systems, and now delivered to what they'd been told was their work assignment. But this didn't look like labor camp or industrial facility. It looked like a farm. The buildings were old stone, weathered by centuries. Fields stretched in every direction, green and ordered, crops growing in neat rows. Sheep grazed on distant hills. A dog barked from near the farmhouse. Everything was peaceful, agricultural, thoroughly civilian. Antonio had expected barbed wire, guard towers, punishment for being captured. Instead, he found himself standing in farmyard while an elderly English farmer walked toward them, wiping his hands on his trousers. Right then, the farmer said in English that Antonio couldn't understand. "Let's see what you lot know about farming." The British guard who'd accompanied them from the processing center translated into rough Italian. The farmer needed workers. His sons were in the army, his hired men had been conscripted, and his farm couldn't operate without labor. The prisoners would work the fields, tend the animals, perform the tasks that kept a farm functioning. In exchange, they'd receive food, accommodation, and treatment according to Geneva Convention standards. Antonio glanced at his fellow prisoners. None of them quite believed this. They were enemy combatants, Axis soldiers who'd fought against British forces. They expected harsh treatment, forced labor under brutal conditions, punishment for their role in Mussolini's war. This farmer talking about crop rotation and milking schedules seemed like elaborate deception, a temporary kindness before real punishment began. But the farmer just kept talking, explaining what work needed doing, showing them the barn where they'd sleep, demonstrating how various farm equipment operated. His manner was matter-of-fact, rather than hostile or friendly. He needed workers, they would be his workers, and everyone would get on with it according to rules and expectations that seemed remarkably normal for wartime arrangement between enemy and captor. The labor crisis. Britain's decision to employ Italian POWs in agricultural work reflected desperate necessity created by total mobilization's demands on domestic workforce. British agriculture had always depended on substantial rural labor force. Farm workers who ploughed and planted and harvested, who tended animals and maintained equipment, who performed the endless physical work that industrial farming still required in 1940s. But conscription had removed most able-bodied young men from farms, sending them to military service. Those who remained were often too old or too young for military duty or had been reserved in agriculture because their work was deemed essential. The result was critical labor shortage at precisely the moment when domestic food production became strategically vital. German U-boats were sinking merchant ships carrying food imports. Britain needed to maximize domestic agricultural output to feed its population and support its military without depending on vulnerable supply lines. But farming was intensely labor-intensive, and labor was exactly what Britain lacked. The government's solution combined several approaches. Women's land, army mobilized thousands of women for agricultural work. Conscientious objectors were assigned to farms rather than military service. School children helped during harvest seasons, and prisoners of war, initially Italian, later German, were deployed to farms that needed workers and had facilities to house them. By 1941, approximately 50,000 Italian POWs were in Britain, captured primarily during North African campaigns where Italian forces had fought with varying effectiveness before being overwhelmed by better-equipped and more experienced British Commonwealth forces. These prisoners represented substantial labor pool if they could be employed productively. Agriculture seemed ideal. Work was needed urgently. Prisoners could be housed on farms under minimal guard. Risk of escape or sabotage was relatively low in rural areas, and many Italian prisoners had farming backgrounds that made them suitable for agricultural labor. The first encounters. The initial meetings between British farmers and Italian prisoners were typically awkward, marked by language barriers, mutual suspicion, and uncertainty about how the arrangement would function. George Hartley, whose farm near Guildford received Antonio Mancini's group, had requested POW labor because he simply couldn't operate his farm otherwise. His two sons were serving with the 8th Army, fighting Italians in North Africa, ironically enough. His regular farmhands had been conscripted. He was 63 years old and couldn't manage alone. He needed workers and didn't particularly care what nationality they were, as long as they could do the work. His initial impression of the Italians was cautiously positive. They were young, most in their early 20s, and fit despite months of captivity. Several had farming experience and understood agricultural work intuitively. Others were clearly urban workers unfamiliar with farming, but they were willing to learn. All of them were nervous, uncertain what to expect, prepared for harsh treatment, but hoping for something better. Hartley's approach was pragmatic rather than ideological. He needed these men to work effectively, which meant treating them decently enough that they'd cooperate. He wasn't interested in punishment or making their lives difficult. He just wanted crops planted, animals tended, work completed to standards his farm required. So he showed them what needed doing, demonstrated techniques when they didn't understand, corrected mistakes without particular cruelty, and generally treated them as workers rather than enemies. The language barrier was a substantial obstacle. Hartley spoke only English. Most of the Italians spoke only Italian. Communication happened through gestures, demonstrations, and the gradual accumulation of shared vocabulary, as both sides learned enough of the other's language to manage basic instructions. The guard assigned to supervise the prisoners spoke some Italian and served as interpreter for complex discussions, but daily work proceeded mostly through pointing and showing rather than verbal explanation. The first days were tentative. The Italians worked carefully, uncertain what standards were expected, wary of punishment for mistakes. Hartley watched them, evaluating their capabilities, adjusting assignments based on who showed aptitude for various tasks. Gradually, routines developed. The prisoners learned the farm's operations. Hartley learned which prisoners could be trusted with which responsibilities. The arrangement began functioning. The gradual transformation. Over weeks and months, relationships between farmers and Italian POWs evolved from purely transactional arrangements into something more complex and surprisingly human. Antonio Mancini discovered that he enjoyed farm work. He'd grown up in rural Tuscany, son of small farmer, and agricultural labor felt familiar despite the English climate and different crops. He understood animals, could handle tools competently, learned quickly when shown new techniques. Hartley recognized his capability and began assigning him more responsibility, eventually trusting him to work independently without constant supervision. This trust was reciprocated. Antonio could have attempted escape or sabotage. Security on the farm was minimal, just one aging guard and Hartley himself. But escape seemed pointless. Where would he go? Italy was too far to reach without help. Britain was surrounded by sea. He was fed adequately, housed tolerably, treated fairly. The war would end eventually, and until then, farm work was preferable to confinement in regular POW camp. So he worked honestly, taking professional pride in tasks completed well, earning Hartley's increasing confidence through demonstrated reliability. Similar patterns developed across British farms, employing Italian prisoners. The arrangement worked because it served everyone's interests. Farmers got labor they desperately needed. Prisoners got relatively comfortable situations and opportunities to work outside camp confines. Both sides discovered that cooperation produced better outcomes than hostility, that treating each other decently made daily life more pleasant for everyone. Small gestures accumulated into meaningful relationships. Hartley began leaving tobacco for prisoners who smoked, not officially permitted, but unofficially tolerated. The Italians responded by doing extra work without being asked, completing tasks to higher standards than strictly necessary. When one prisoner demonstrated woodworking skills, Hartley provided tools and materials for the man to craft furniture during leisure hours. When another showed musical talent, Hartley located a battered accordion that had belonged to his son, offering it to the prisoner for camp entertainment. The interactions weren't friendship exactly. The barrier of nationality and circumstances remained clear, but they were human connections, recognition that shared work created bonds that transcended the formal captor-prisoner relationship. British farmers and Italian prisoners discovered they had more in common than they'd expected. Love of land and growing things, professional pride in work done well, appreciation for simple pleasures like good food and tobacco, and music after long days of physical labor. The community integration. As months passed, Italian POWs became visible presence in rural British communities, creating interactions that sometimes surprised both prisoners and civilians. The local pub near Hartley's farm initially refused to serve Italians, but that policy quietly changed when prisoners started appearing with their guards or with farmers who employed them. The landlord recognized that POWs represented paying customers. Their wages were minimal but sufficient for occasional pint, and that refusing service created unnecessary tension. So he served them, and gradually the sight of Italian prisoners drinking alongside British civilians became unremarkable rather than scandalous. Church presented more complex situation. Many Italian prisoners were Catholic in regions where Catholicism was minority faith. Some asked permission to attend services. British authorities, recognizing religious observations' importance for morale and Geneva Convention compliance, generally permitted attendance when local Catholic churches existed. This created odd sight of Italian enemy soldiers worshipping alongside British Catholics, united by shared faith despite their nations being at war. One parish priest near Norwich found himself ministering to congregation that included British parishioners and Italian prisoners. He later recalled, "It was rather surreal, conducting Mass with British women whose sons were fighting in Italy, alongside Italian prisoners whose families were being bombed by British aircraft, but we were all Christians, and in church, that mattered more than nationality." British children approached Italian prisoners with curiosity that adults often suppressed. Prisoners working in fields near villages found themselves subjects of fascinated observation by children who'd never seen foreigners before. Some prisoners carried candies they'd saved from rations, offering them to curious children in universal gesture of adult kindness toward young people. Parents' reactions varied from horror at fraternization to grudging acceptance that prisoners who acted kindly toward children couldn't be entirely dangerous. Romance occasionally developed between Italian prisoners and British women, creating scandal and controversy, but also demonstrating that human connections couldn't be entirely prevented by national enmity or regulations prohibiting fraternization. Most such relationships were quiet affairs, conducted discreetly to avoid official attention. Some continued after war's end, resulting in marriages that brought Italian men back to Britain as permanent residents rather than temporary prisoners. The work itself. The agricultural labor Italian prisoners performed was vital to Britain's wartime food production and gave prisoners sense of purpose that strict confinement couldn't provide. British farming in 1940s required substantial manual labor despite mechanization that had simplified some tasks. Fields needed plowing and planting. Crops required tending and harvesting. Animals demanded daily care, regardless of weather or other considerations. The work was physically demanding, often boring, sometimes dangerous when dealing with large animals or heavy equipment. But it was productive work with visible results. Seeds became crops, crops became food, food sustained population and military. For prisoners accustomed to military life's purposelessness, endless drilling, waiting, make-work tasks designed to maintain discipline rather than accomplish anything meaningful, agricultural work offered satisfaction of genuine productivity. Antonio Mancini took pride in fields he'd helped plant coming to harvest, in animals he'd tended remaining healthy, in barns he'd helped repair standing straight and weatherproof. The work had meaning beyond simply occupying time until repatriation. The prisoners' productivity impressed British authorities monitoring the program. Reports documented that Italian POWs were completing agricultural work efficiently and with quality comparable to civilian workers. Some farms reported that Italian prisoners were more productive than some previous British employees, working longer hours with fewer complaints. This wasn't universal. Some prisoners were lazy or incompetent. Some farms had management problems that prevented effective work. But the overall assessment was positive enough that the program expanded. By 1943, approximately 75,000 Italian prisoners were employed in British agriculture, along with additional numbers in forestry, construction, and other essential industries. They represented substantial portion of Britain's agricultural workforce during critical years when food production was strategically vital. Their contribution to keeping Britain fed during the war was significant, though rarely acknowledged publicly given sensitivities about celebrating enemy prisoners' work. The shift after Italy's surrender. Italy's armistice with Allies in September 1943 transformed Italian prisoners' status from enemy POWs to co-belligerents, creating complicated situations for prisoners and their British employers. Technically, Italian prisoners were no longer enemies once Italy surrendered. They could be released from POW status and employed as civilian workers. But practicalities complicated simple transition. Many prisoners had nowhere to go. Italy was occupied and divided. Their homes were in combat zones. Families were displaced or unreachable. Simply releasing them into British society without support or documentation would create chaos. British authorities implemented compromise. Italian prisoners could volunteer to join labor units that would work under military organization but with status closer to civilian workers than POWs. They'd receive better wages, more freedom of movement, and eventually possibility of remaining in Britain as free workers after war's end. Most prisoners accepted this arrangement, recognizing it offered better conditions and potential for permanent settlement in Britain if they chose. Antonio Mancini volunteered immediately. He'd spent 2 years working on Hartley's farm, had learned English reasonably well, had come to appreciate British culture despite its differences from Italian norms. When offered chance to remain as civilian worker, he accepted without hesitation. Hartley, recognizing Antonio's value and having grown accustomed to his presence, supported the transition enthusiastically. The change in status altered relationships subtly but significantly. Antonio was no longer prisoner but employee, no longer enemy but ally of sorts. He could leave the farm when off duty, could visit nearby village without guard, could interact with British civilians as near equal rather than captive. The relationship with Hartley shifted from employer-prisoner to employer-employee, losing some of its formal structure but gaining ease and comfort that hadn't been possible under previous arrangement. The personal connections. Individual relationships between Italian prisoners and British families sometimes developed into lasting bonds that transcended war's temporary circumstances. Maria Thompson, widow whose husband had been killed in France in 1940, employed Italian prisoner named Giuseppe Rossi on her small farm in Kent. She needed labor to maintain property, had been assigned Rossi through local POW allocation system. Initially viewed him with suspicion, mixed with practical necessity. He was enemy soldier, but he could also plow fields and tend animals, and she needed that work done. Rossi was quiet, competent, clearly uncomfortable in his situation, but determined to make best of it. He worked hard, asked few questions, accepted Maria's instructions without complaint. Gradually, Maria's suspicion faded. He was just a young man doing farm work, no different in essentials from British farmhands she'd employed before the war. She began treating him less formally, offering tea during breaks, allowing him to eat lunch in the kitchen rather than in the barn, conversing in broken mixture of English and Italian about farming and weather and everyday concerns. The relationship remained proper and distant by modern standards, but it represented genuine human connection. Maria shared photographs of her late husband, explained how he died, expressed her grief to someone who listened sympathetically despite language barriers. Rossi talked about his family in Calabria, his hopes to return home when war ended, his confusion about why he'd been sent to fight in North Africa for cause he didn't understand or support. When war ended and repatriation began, Rossi asked if he could stay in Britain. His home region was devastated, his family scattered, his prospects there minimal. Britain, by contrast, offered employment and stability. Maria had offered him permanent position on her farm, and he'd accepted. Maria helped him navigate immigration procedures, provided references attesting to his character and work ethic, supported his application to remain in Britain as civilian resident. Their relationship evolved eventually into marriage in 1947, creating scandal in some quarters but acceptance in others. Maria's neighbors had grown accustomed to Rossi's presence, recognized his contribution to maintaining Maria's farm, acknowledged that British widows needed to rebuild lives however they could. The marriage raised eyebrows, but didn't provoke the outrage that might have occurred had it happened during active hostilities. Similar stories played out across Britain. Not hundreds, but enough to be notable pattern rather than isolated incidents. Italian prisoners who'd formed connections with British employers, who'd demonstrated reliability and competence over years, who'd become integrated into local communities sufficiently that remaining in Britain seemed more practical than returning to devastated Italy. Many received support from British families who'd employed them, who'd come to view them as individuals rather than enemies, who recognized that young men's futures shouldn't be destroyed by war they hadn't chosen. The quiet ending. Antonio Mancini left Hartley's farm in June 1946, returning to Italy after 5 years in Britain. Hartley drove him to the train station, shook his hand, gave him an address where letters could be sent. Antonio promised to write, to stay in contact, to perhaps visit England someday when circumstances permitted. Both men understood They probably wouldn't see each other again, but maintained the fiction of continued friendship because it felt appropriate to acknowledge what their relationship had meant. Antonio wrote once, several months later, describing his return to Tuscany and his efforts to rebuild family farm with his father and brothers who'd survived the war. Hartley wrote back, sharing news about the farm and wishing Antonio well. Then correspondence lapsed, both men returning to their separate lives in their separate countries, their wartime connection becoming memory rather than active relationship. This pattern repeated thousands of times, prisoners departing, employers saying goodbye, promises made to stay in contact that were sometimes kept, but more often faded as distance and time reasserted themselves. The relationships had been real within their wartime context, but couldn't easily survive transition to peacetime when the circumstances that created them no longer existed. For those who remained in Britain, the transition was different. Giuseppe Rossi, staying on Maria Thompson's farm and eventually marrying her, had to navigate being former enemy in adopted country, maintaining his Italian identity while building British life. His experience was a mixture of acceptance and occasional prejudice, comfort with his choice, and ongoing connection to Italy he'd left behind. He built successful life in Britain, but carried permanent sense of being between two worlds, neither fully Italian nor fully British, but some combination that belonged entirely to neither. The Italian POW experience in Britain demonstrated that even in war, humans could recognize each other's humanity, that practical cooperation could develop between enemies, that former foes could sometimes become friends or at least friendly acquaintances. It showed that decent treatment of prisoners served both moral imperatives and practical objectives, that maintaining civilized standards, even toward enemies, reflected strength rather than weakness. These lessons weren't unique to Italian POWs in Britain. Similar patterns emerged in other contexts, but they were clearly demonstrated in program that succeeded far better than pessimists had expected.